Shannon is a human rights activist, an artist, an author, a filmmaker. She is a fellow of the Royal Geographic Society and Explorer Club, and a former National Geographic Adventurer of the Year. In 2009, Shannon became the first person to mountain bike in Afghanistan. She continued to travel through Afghanistan by bike for several years, using the bike as a tool to explore gender barriers. She supported and trained the first Afghan women's cycling team and helped build and support the burgeoning Right to Ride movement in Afghanistan. The International Olympic Committee awarded Shannon an honorary achievement diploma for promoting gender equity through sports. She focuses her own artwork through the lens of social justice, using the mediums of wheat paste, murals, and installation art. And she has created public art installations in Afghanistan, France, England, and throughout the US. She is a producer of the documentary film Afghan Cycles, and she has authored 2 books, including her memoir, Mountain to Mountain, and Streets of Afghanistan, the book documenting the first collaborative public art installation in Afghanistan. So please join me in welcoming Shannon Galpin to the stage.
Thank you so much for such a gracious welcome, and thank you to everyone at the Cincinnati Art Museum who put together such an incredible exhibition around bikes, a vehicle that I hold near and dear to my heart, that has been part of my life for literally as long as I can remember. I don't even remember my very first memory on a bike. I do remember my father accidentally running over my very first bike when I left it behind his car, but I don't remember my first memory riding it. I stand here tonight really struggling to find words, and I've struggled more than I ever have putting together this slideshow, even though I have put together so many PowerPoints and slideshows of these incredible young women in Afghanistan. But I would be remiss if I didn't address the fact that our country is waging a genocide and we're in the throes of a coup. So how do I talk about bikes when my country is bombing another that I have called home and other countries where I have friends? Where do bikes fit into the state of the world right now? Thank you. At the same time, I can acknowledge when I look backwards, bikes have been part of the French resistance fighting fascism and Nazis. They are part of an all-black US Army infantry called the Buffalo Soldiers. Members of the Amsterdam resistance used a bicycle-powered mimeograph to stencil underground newspapers. Mm-hmm. Bikes are intrinsically linked with feminism, equal rights, the right to vote, not just here in the US, but in the UK, in France, and numerous other countries, not just through the global north, but across the global south. And I am standing here today in pants, thanks to the necessary invention of fashion that women bike riders required and thus created. Mm-hmm. So, I think it reminds me, and has reminded me over the past couple of weeks, that it is always a good time to talk about bikes. 18 years ago, I fell in love with mountain biking and Afghanistan, which I do admit is an unlikely pairing. But my very first trip to Afghanistan in 2008, this was the scene that greeted me on every street, in urban cities like Kabul and in rural communities. Bikes were everywhere, and they were often covered by more than one rider. But what struck me in my joy of seeing bikes everywhere was that it was always men and boys riding them. Not once did I see a girl or a woman riding a bike. If I saw a woman on a bike, and this is a picture from my very first trip in 2008, she was always side saddle. She was not always in a burqa. I don't want to hold this as the image of all Afghan women, but this is a picture from my very first trip, and they were always side saddle. If you have ridden a bike, take that as an image as to how do you ride a bike side saddle through but many streets that are potholed, many that were unpaved, and somehow these incredible women stayed put and trusted whoever was steering. And despite what this image may imply, especially through our Western lens, what I discovered time and time again was that Afghan women were not victims. And I want you to hold that throughout this talk more than anything else. Afghan women have agency. Afghan women had agency, no matter what it was that they were wearing. I traveled to Afghanistan in an effort to understand women in their wholeness, not through the narrow lens of what I was being told through the media. I wanted to learn who they were. I wanted to understand what had been taken from them throughout the Taliban period that had preceded my visit. And I wanted to understand what they wanted, what they needed, what they wanted to become, and what they wanted for their families. One of the women that I met with, Dr. Roshanak Wardak, is I think the epitome of the type of woman that I met throughout my time in Afghanistan. And I've been there over 25 times over a period of 8 years. And I come back to Dr. Wardak time and time again. She was an OBGYN, that's what she was trained as. But when I met her, she was a parliamentarian. And when I met her, Afghan women had near equal representation in the Afghan parliament. In 2008, we did not have equal representation as women in Congress and in the House of Representatives. She was fierce. She was badass. She was fully in control of her agency. She was brave. She worked in a very conservative province. Wardak was very much, and still was until the Taliban regained control. It had pockets of Taliban within it. She was dedicated to her patients and dedicated to her country. I met throughout that visit in 2008 with organizers, with burgeoning activists, with teachers, with restaurant owners, with business owners, with women in prison. I met with women who were running heroin rehab centers and women who were patients of those centers. My goal was to understand the width and breadth of the country through the lens of being a woman. Each meeting, every interview, every time I got to sit down taught me something new from a completely different perspective. And as I started my own projects, I began to interrogate the lens of gender barriers through the taboo of cycling. Because in Afghanistan, despite all of the women that I met that had this incredible agency, that were breaking through the barriers that had been put in place under Taliban rule, cycling was still the last taboo. And everyone that I met, when I would ask them, would you let your daughter ride? Would you let your sister ride? Would you let your cousin ride? Replied, absolutely not. And yet, I was sitting down with their wives and sisters that were parliamentarians, that were judges, some that were being trained as policewomen. But the bike was still taboo. My projects included school deliveries in remote mountain villages, computer labs in girls' schools, the first school for the deaf, and throughout all of these projects, always asking everyone I met, everywhere I went, would you let your girls ride a bike? 1 year later, I decided that I would put my own experience on the line, and I brought over my single speed and drove out to the Panjshir Valley. And in the remote mountains in the Panjshir, where I knew some Afghans, I felt safe kind of taking on this experiment. On a dry riverbed that I also knew was clear of landmines, I put my mountain bike down and mountain biked for the first time in Afghanistan. It was wholly regarded as a curiosity, and I encountered numerous Afghans that exclaimed with curiosity, not animosity, and why are you here? What are you doing? Come to my house for tea. Immediately the next day, I was at an all-boys school. Now, this all-boys school that was about 2 villages away from the dry riverbed, I had delivered school supplies at. So I knew them. I knew that I could, push the boundaries a little bit. I drug my bike up behind the school, and I rode my bike down this scree-covered mountain, slip-sliding all the way down, and past the school, past about 600 young boys who had never seen a girl ride a bike before. They all cheered, except for one who threw a rock. Over the next 3 years, every trip that I spent in Afghanistan, I took time, no matter where I was, to experiment with riding a bike in a different area of the country, in a different community, in a different landscape, interacting with different people. Afghanistan is not a monolith. There are multiple ethnicities. There are incredible provinces and language differences, and each of those experiences led to different conversations around bikes. In one instance, in Kabul, with the balloon seller, it led again to invitations to come back and meet his family, but also conversations about his first memories riding bikes. And in the old gardens of Darlaman Palace, this gentleman here was the gardener of Darlaman Palace. He claimed to be around 80 years old, and that he had been the gardener since he was a young man. And as he encountered me riding a bike and he pulled up with his bike, we spent about an hour just talking about his memories as he's seeing these changes through Kabul as a gardener and kind of that experience. Had I not had a bike, he would never have stopped and talked to me as a foreign woman. But the bike became the icebreaker and allowed us to connect. And my favorite bike that I've ever encountered, if this could be in the museum, it would by far be the greatest bike in the exhibition. It has windmills and fake flowers and fire vases and speakers that are hooked up to it that don't seem to be actually hooked up to anything that blares music, but it has the speakers. It's got some sort of fur and things wrapped around the front. It had beautiful things all up in the spokes. I was offered this bike by a gentleman who was riding back and forth as I was setting up this art installation. And I commented and said, your bike is very beautiful, makbulast. And he offered it to me to ride. And I thought maybe he's joking. He thought I wasn't serious, and I immediately climbed on to take it for a spin. And I started riding it back and forth up the market street, and I found out from my friend afterwards, as I'm riding back and forth, they kind of nudged each other, and he goes, we never see women ride bikes. It takes a lot of intelligence to ride a bike, and that's why we don't see that so much. It was a beautiful insight because in no way was he offended. In no way did he think it was a cultural norm. He simply thought that the reason that women didn't ride bikes was not because it was a taboo, not because it was obscene, not because it was controversial, or because women would be dishonored by riding them, but because they simply lacked the intelligence to ride. So hopefully we change that a little bit by the exposure of normalization. When we would go around Afghanistan, when I would go around Afghanistan, when we talk about bikes and why bikes are so important and why the suffragettes used bikes as a statement around freedom of mobility and mobility justice, when girls are forced to walk to school but their brothers get to ride a bike, it radically changes access. Girls often were forced to walk to a school that maybe would take 45 minutes. Boys could get there in 10 minutes. It often was the difference of whether or not fathers would let their girls go to school, not because they were against education, but because it was a safety issue. Or because it was simply too far stamina-wise. Sometimes the school would simply be an hour and a half's walk away, and that was too far for little girls to get to. In this case, there was a group of girls that the Taliban were still in control of an area, and they kept landmining the roads. If they had bikes, they could have gone a different way. So bikes come back to an issue around mobility justice and whether or not they're allowed to use space equally. Girls were playing sports. They were playing football, soccer, they were playing basketball, volleyball. Sometimes they were starting to play cricket. Taekwondo was huge. And to my great surprise and pleasure, I met the first women who were part of the national boxing team. If you can imagine what that felt like to see these women training in a basement, learning to box. It wasn't that it was about the sport, it's about the obscenity of straddling a bike frame, which was exactly the same reason that suffragettes a century earlier were considered obscene, promiscuous, bad women. It isn't about the exercise. It is about whether or not we look at bikes beyond a sport, and it comes back to, are they allowed to claim space equally? Are they allowed the same access to space? And are they allowed to be in public in the same way? I was always hoping when I would go out for a bike ride and girls would gather that one of the girls would ask to ride. They never did, despite the curiosity, despite often following me around. The curiosity was there, but so was the taboo. The abuse and the insults was just like the 1800s when women began to ride. The fact that women were considered obscene, promiscuous, bad women. I think most of us here, if you have seen anything around what it is like to be part of bike culture, the 1800s have a whole history and a wealth of information around what the suffragettes went through. And this is always so stunning to me because when we look at Afghan women in the burqas and we think, well, how could that be dishonorable? How could we look at that and say, well, if women are wearing this, that they're obscene? Well, women who were dressed head to toe in hats and long sleeves and long skirts were considered obscene, promiscuous, simply because they rode. And this imagery of Afghan women is rarely shown to us. This is Afghan women in the 60s and 70s. So when we look back, we have to understand, I think a little bit of Afghan history. Afghan women went to university. They are not the victims that our media portrays. Their liberation is often the reason given that our U.S. Or why the U.S. occupied their country for 20 years. But the imagery from the 60s and 70s shows us that the grandmothers of the young women today were not much different than the women you would meet anywhere in the 60s and 70s. They went to university, they hung out in record stores, and the stories that I have from a lot of Afghan women whose mothers, grandmothers were from this era were of the interactions with Westerners who specifically went to Afghanistan to join the hippie trail. Musicians, troubadours, there was a lot of good marijuana at the time, and that brought a lot of tourism through Afghanistan. And there are these incredible outdoor concerts and this interaction of people who simply went to Afghanistan to travel. The granddaughters of these young women are women like this. The granddaughters who grew up in the post-Taliban era defied the labels that the West wanted to put on them. They are the women that I met starting in 2008 of activists, young artists. They're the girls who went to school knowing that they would go to university. They were the next generation of parliamentarians, athletes, and judges. And some of them became the first generation of Afghan cyclists. These young women became the Afghan national cycling team. And I met the very first group of them in 2012. After 4 years of riding across Afghanistan, looking for girls riding bikes, interrogating the taboo, always being told, no, it's just not our culture, by every man I asked, I met the first group of girls, and they were taking over the streets and the highways in Kabul. If you look towards the back of the picture, you'll see a young man, I think he's in purple. Yeah, he's in purple. The first group of girls riding with the national team often had members of the men's national team riding with them, which was incredibly powerful because the men were riding to help give them a buffer, particularly when they rode on the highways, and also to show solidarity, that they were with them. And often, throughout all of my projects, this is kind of the untold story of the solidarity of Afghan men, of Muslim men, is the fathers, the brothers, the cousins. They are acting as allies all of the time, whether that is a silent ally, kind of in the background, like the cyclists, just making sure that they're helping build the numbers to give protection for cars, just like we would on group rides, or whether it's kind of public allies really speaking up, pushing back, when necessary to stand up for their little sisters or partners. In the spring of 2013, after I had met the girls in the fall of 2012, I started fundraising, trying to raise money for bikes, trying to gather up some secondhand equipment to bring back over. And when I came back in the spring, I finally got to ride with women for the very first time. And this is your first iteration of the Afghan cycling team. And some of these women are really important to know because on the far left, so your left, is Masuma Alizada. So remember the name of Masuma. And this was her maybe her first or second ride. She could not ride in a straight line. And we were there with the film crew for this trip. So trying to get her to ride with the rest of the group was a nightmare. She couldn't ride in a straight line. And the bikes were these big, oversized steel men's bikes. Some of them didn't shift well. Some of them, the brakes didn't work really well. And she got into the habit of not trusting her brakes. So she would kind of like Fred Flintstone style, drag her feet to slow down. Swear to God, I thought she was going to break her ankles and just flip through the bike. But Masuma was one of the very first girls. Next to her is Nazifa, and Nazifa had been one of the original kind of OG members. Next, on the other side of me is a young woman named Sadaf, and then next to Sadaf was the first woman I ever met back in 2012, and that's Miriam. She was the captain of the team, and she was kind of the matriarchal figure. She was only a couple years older, but had this very strong matriarchal, more serious presence. And her job was in a beauty parlor. So she also had like flawless nails, red lipstick, strong eyebrows. She would like thread everybody's eyebrows in between trainings. Everybody looked flawless. The bikes were big steel, oversized bikes, like I mentioned. And when we were lucky, or if I had come into town and we got some, we would load them up. We'd rent a truck and we'd load them up and get them out past the highway, out of Kabul, onto some quieter roads. But that was usually they got loaded onto the coach's car. I was able to get live bikes, which at the time was Giant bikes, before they fully split into a men's and women's bike line. Giant bikes gave me 65 brand new racing bikes. They were partially carbon, so we had a big talk about like how are we going to transport these, because they're just getting thrown into the back of a truck. So we had to have a long talk about how were we going to transport these. But I showed up at United Airlines with 65 bike boxes, plus 450 pounds of donated gear, and then just said, this is my extra luggage. And it's going to Afghanistan via DC, Dubai, Kabul. All of it arrived, not one lost bag. I lose my bags like on direct flights to Minneapolis. And all of it arrived. It immediately got impounded. But after 2 full days of very sad meetings, getting signatures and paperwork in a very dark government building, I got all of released the bikes, got them all released, and started building them. Now, I'm a single-speed mountain biker. I don't know how to thread cables. I don't know how to build a derailleur, but I had watched a lot of YouTube, and my landlord at the time was a bike mechanic. I was very lucky. So we had built a couple before I left. He walked through it very patiently, and I felt like I got this. So we began building them. Most of them were built in Kabul for the national team. A few men's bikes for a couple of the guys that needed them. And then I took some to Bamiyan, and you can see one of the Buddha caves where the Taliban had blown up the Buddhas. There's 2 big Buddha caves in Bamiyan. The Buddha caves behind me, so I had this incredible backdrop from my friend's guest house to build up the rest of the bikes. And I was preparing to bring the national team to Bamiyan for their very first training camp. The bikes, the gear, we got more helmets, because the girls a lot of times weren't even racing or weren't training in helmets, meant that the team started to grow. They started to invite more people and started to take it more seriously. We also started eating, which sounds ridiculous, but if any of you ride bikes, eating and hydrating is kind of a big part of it, not just for enjoyment, but also so you don't bonk and crash. They had no concept of the training that goes into it. The coach was a coach that just basically organized them, got them out, dumped them, and blew a whistle. So we had some talks about what is hydration for a ride, what is eating after a ride and during a ride. But what was great is in Afghanistan, your post-meal rides were huge, giant plates of Kabuli rice, green tea, dumplings. It wasn't granola bars. And we ate piles of lamb. And we got back on the bikes and rode home. Mm-hmm. Part of what we had to get them were passports. These women didn't have passports, but they were starting to get good enough that they could ride internationally, the Southeast Asia championships. They could get across to Pakistan without a passport. They could just use their Afghan IDs, and so they were racing in Pakistan back and forth. But to get to any of the other races, one of them being in Kazakhstan, they needed to have passports. So a big part of it was that I needed to buy them passports. I needed to fund their visas. So fundraising was a big part of it, but just the access that needed to happen in order to get passports when a lot of Afghans do not have birth certificates. hurdles after hurdles after hurdles. But as we started to grow, as they started to race, we brought them out to Bamiyan. We had their first real training camp. You can see them in their first matching jerseys. We had like a bike mandala made that was just bikes all spun around. And part of the reason that I brought them to Bamiyan was that it had very safe roads, because it was a much more rural community. It's about a 7-hour drive out of Kabul, or a 30-minute flight. And it's kind of in the mountains, it's in the foothills of the Hindu Kush. But also there was a young woman in Bamiyan that had started riding bikes at the same time as the national team, but completely isolated in this other bubble. She had learned to ride as a refugee in Iran, and when she came back to Afghanistan, started teaching the other girls in the area to ride bikes so that they could get to school, because the boys could ride, they could not, and the university had cut the bus. So now they had no transportation to get to the university. So Zara, who is the young woman in the glasses, Zara Hosseini, is probably the very first woman to ride bikes in Afghanistan. I believe she started before the team, like just before. She definitely learned to ride before anybody else in Afghanistan, because she was riding in Iran before. But she's probably also the first one to start teaching others to ride bikes, which means women were teaching women to ride bikes before the team formed. She started a club of girls, and that club formed with her best friend Zakia Mohammadi. I had hoped that bringing the team to Bamiyan would introduce the coach to Zakia, and then the federation, because this is a federation, would look at what was happening in Bamiyan and look at the fact that you can't have a national team and that's your only team in the entire country. You start to have provincial teams, just like anywhere else in the world. And coach completely blanked her, wanted nothing to do with it because he had no control of her. And she, to her credit, wanted nothing to do with him. She goes, "We got this, we don't need you." So Zakia and Zara organized their own rides without any male oversight or interference or support. I supported them with more bikes and whatever, however I could help. This is Zakia and other members of the team. They flourished. And they are the very first women-led, women-founded club, which then became a team, an officially registered team. The part that's really amazing is that they organized the very first races for women in Afghanistan's history. It wasn't the federation. It wasn't the coach. It wasn't the national team. It was these young women in Bamiyan that organized their very first races for women. And that then led to eventually that expanding, that the federation needed to kind of encompass that, because you can't have a bunch of girls in the mountains organizing women's racing and the federation not even allowing the national team to participate. So they did that. And what I started to do with them was start to look at where were the gaps. We needed basic bike maintenance. We realized that they didn't have basic bike maintenance. Where were the dependencies? And they started to work with the community in ways to bring in their allies. Amir Ansari was another name to remember for later. Amir Ansari was one of the staunchest allies. He was a member of the men's national team, even though he lived in Bamiyan. And he was Zara's best friend. They would organize protest rides and demonstration rides and awareness rides in addition to the races. And this ride is part of a global campaign with the UN that they have every fall, and it's around gender violence. And it always uses the color orange. So they had all the girls and the men that participated wearing orange scarves. And they taught other young girls to ride. They started to have almost like a baby club. And then that started to feed into the other club. But Amir was there every step of the way. When a kind of local warlord stole the girls' bikes because he felt that the person who was holding the bikes for them, storing them for the girls, owed him money. So he took the girls' bikes as leverage for this other guy. He helped me steal them back. He was the ally of allies. We went in, rented a truck, and the two of us stole them all back. He was there every step of the way. This was what women's cycling was about. They did not get the credit because it was easier to give the national team the credit over and over again, because they were the ones that were competing internationally. Amazingly, a third bubble emerged in parallel at the same time back in Kabul that was founded by a young woman named Fatima who had started a bike club just to teach her girlfriends how to ride. And so to get them on bikes, we had a third method, which was there was this bike market in Kabul. And I didn't want the girls for me just to donate bikes. They didn't need racing bikes, they just needed street bikes. And I wanted to help them be normalized in the bike market. So they got cash donation so that they could go buy their own bikes and normalize women in the bike market. But the gentleman in the red bike jersey is a bike mechanic. And he would make sure that he would coordinate with the girls when they wanted to go, and he would be at the bike market, because he was known there, so that there would be an ally there that he wasn't buying the bike, and he didn't act like he knew them, but he would make sure he checked the bike out to make sure it was roadworthy, that they weren't getting taken advantage of, and just kind of be a subtle ally for us and kind of be a plant. And these girls were not subtle. These were radical girls who they just learned to ride a bike, and there was nothing meek about them. They unapologetically took over the streets in Kabul, and you would expect that girls who had just learned to ride would single file down, kind of hug the side of the road and go. What you see right there is how they rode down the street. So they're riding down the streets of Kabul in pink, sequined, wild outfits, astride, making the jingle trucks and the men and their motorcycles wait for them. Just wide smiles, doing their thing, and then they would pull off after a little bit and turn the corner and do what they needed to do. But they were bold. And again, that is the image that we need to understand when we think of these young Afghan women. Bold. Soon, more girls' clubs started because these women started to be seen in the streets. They normalized what it looked like to be a young woman. More bike clubs formed. Some co-ed bike clubs formed. And eventually, the men's BMX, there was a BMX club, kind of like a trials team. Girls started joining the BMX team. A mountain bike club formed in Kabul and in Bamiyan, girls and boys. And competitions for both mountain biking and BMX began. My goal was prioritizing keeping the leaderships connected, because that wasn't going to happen with the Federation. So I brought Fatima out to meet Zara and tried to make some of the threading happen that hadn't happened with the coach. So at least some of the women knew who each other was and could make those connections, even if they couldn't ride with each other outside of these little short meetings because of geography. They knew that other women were riding, and they could share those stories back and forth. In 2015, the national team, to me, it was all of the women, because Zara and Zakia's team deserved it even more, but all of the Afghan cyclists, under the label of the Afghan National Cycling Team, was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize, and as National Geographic Adventurers of the Year in the same year. They were on the cover of lots of international magazines. They were the subject of a lot of newspapers. And it felt like that movement was moving forward, like that there was a real cultural shift. And in Afghanistan there was, because what was seen as obscene and controversial, and rocks were thrown. One was run over by a motorcycle. Some had night letters. You know, this was not without risk. But they were starting to build pride for the country of Afghanistan. That pride started to, you know, like the national pride that sports can bring started to shift the cultural and the social change. And the girls started riding more and more in other provinces beyond Kabul and Bamiyan. The risks weren't decreasing because they also had to deal with an increase in 2015 where the security was decreasing. The risks were increasing as the security decreased. There was more roadside bombs. There was more checkpoint issues. The Taliban was gaining more control across the country. And yet still, the popularity of cycling was increasing. It wasn't putting them off. So there was a strength in the numbers as more women rode. The issues that had put so many off in the beginning of safety and security didn't matter as much anymore. And even though the families often were worrying and would voice their disapproval, the safety in numbers, the fact that there were enough male allies, often built enough of a security blanket around it. It speaks to the bravery of women and the imagery of bikes as a radical act of empowerment that makes women who ride a target, not just in Afghanistan, but throughout the world. Because when women ride bikes, they are considered radical. And I love this photo from Cambridge University back in 1897. 7 years after a woman, Philippa Fawcett, received the highest marks of anyone else, you know, any woman, any man, in maths, Cambridge Senate voted on the question of whether or not women could be awarded degrees. Because up to that point, women could attend classes, but women could not get a degree. Crucially, the debate question was if this vote meant whether offering women the title of a degree, if they didn't just come to class, but if they got a degree, if the powers of this degree would allow them to take part in governance of the university. And the male students opposed to women's membership of the university protested in the streets, and the effigy of a woman in trousers riding a bike was hung above the King's Parade. It was later mutilated. After the vote took place and women were defeated, men overturned stalls, set off fireworks, ran through the streets. Men rioted after hanging an effigy and then mutilating it of a woman on a bike. Men rioted not just because women demanded to be treated equally, not better, not special, just the same. In Afghanistan, women that dared to ride are absolutely no different. Culturally, this is no different. Britain, Afghanistan, the US, when we talk about bikes, women on bikes, we fought for education, we fight for the right to work, the right to be seen, to walk in public safely, for equal freedom of mobility, the right to ride. And like the US and British women who did not back down, Afghan women continued to ride. Despite the threats to their lives, the night letters, the rocks thrown, their numbers only grew. And by the time the Taliban marched into Kabul in August 2021, there were over 200 registered riders, that's riders with the Federation, and in over 7 provinces That means there was hundreds more, like Zakia and Zara, riding in teams like Banyan and other clubs. There were 0 when I started. A decade later, over 200 registered. By the day that the Taliban walked into Kabul, my phone was already flooded with messages like this one. Please help, our lives are in danger. The Taliban attacked Kabul near us. Please, we fled to people's houses. They will kill me, my husband, and my daughter if they find me. 10 years of a cycling revolution that ended overnight on August 15th, 2021. I could never have imagined that I would spend the next 2 years, 7 days a week, 24 hours on call, evacuating the cyclists and the family members, setting up safe houses and getting them resettled. For those who might not be able to read this, one of the many messages that flooded my phones, my DMs, any electronic device that I could be reached on, hundreds of messages just like this one that said, yes, the airport has become very dangerous, only the sound of shooting. People do not move at the airport and the Taliban check every 10 meters. I do not know how to get to the plane. I hid in my friend's house and I burned all my bicycle accessories and bicycle clothing. Others that I know in Bamiyan buried their bicycles, buried their bicycle clothing, buried or burned their diplomas. The most recent evacuations that I made were this summer, just before the Paris Olympics. It's not over. I still have 2 prominent male cyclists stuck in Afghanistan. I evacuated them to Pakistan, and then they were forced out 2 years later by the Pakistanis, and they're now back in Afghanistan. The Taliban stole their families' homes, and they are now in hiding. It took hundreds of thousands of dollars to evacuate the cyclists, set up safe houses, and then resettle them. They've now been dispersed and resettled into 11 different countries. This is what my timeline looked like in my WhatsApp, and what my photos looked like from my WhatsApp dumps, and they would automatically come in. So this is what my timelines would look like. Passports, visas, documents, ID cards. A lucky handful got onto airplanes during the first 2 weeks that the airport remained open and the media kept eyes on Afghanistan. And I got Fatima, the founder of the Kabul Bike Club, and her siblings out on one of the airplanes when the airport was open for that 2-3 weeks. It took a $4,000 taxi ride, fake visas, 12 strangers that I was digitally connected to gather flight information like the tail number of the airplane, phone numbers of the soldiers on the wall and inside the airport, so that she could stand in a sewer screaming to be let into her own airport for a flight that she had tickets for. When they finally got onto the flight, as you can see, the flight was empty because nobody else could get through the airport gates. We got one of the Bamiyan teams, which was the legacy of Zara and Zakia. This was essentially the next generation team, out by road. I was able to get them out before maybe a week after the airport closed, before people started trying to move people by road. I got one big group out, 45 people, by road through Tajikistan, closed borders, and they all went to stay. They were forced to then go through Tajikistan to UAE, where they stayed at the UAE Emirates City. The UAE Emirates City is essentially a pay-to-play detention center. They were all given visas to go to Canada, but they were stuck in the detention center for 7 months. 3 were left behind. These 3 were stuck there for almost a year in a deteriorating situation until I was able to get Human Rights Watch to publish a report about the detention center and the US State Department was willing to give them visas, along with several others like them that were stuck there. They are now in Seattle, and thanks to a dear friend, they have gotten 2 of the families reunited with them. Slowly, 1 carload at a time, I got over 85 people to Pakistan, set up safe houses, and they stayed there for almost a year. We had to house them, feed them, take care of medical emergencies. This required raising the money myself, hundreds of thousands of dollars, and to care for, in total, over 150 Afghans. The majority that were evacuated for Pakistan, that were set up in safe houses, just waited and waited and waited for word that we could move onwards, that we had visas, that maybe we could get a golden ticket, essentially. And one day, one of the girls went to the park, and 4 of them went to the park, and one of the girls took the flowers and arranged them into this word and sent it to me. I burst out crying when I saw it, because hope is a word that I use often in my artwork. I've done street art campaigns around hope during COVID. It's one of the only things that has kept me going. I knew it was the only thing keeping them going, but it can feel quite empty. In the end, 72 were approved for an Italian humanitarian flight, and that hope was rewarded for this particular group when they sent me photos, particularly coming down the stairs of the flight. These women risked their lives to ride bikes, and then they fled their country because they were targets. When we say that bikes are for everyone, what does that even mean? Because throughout history, what I see is bikes held up as a beacon of freedom and access, of joy. It is the most egalitarian vehicle we've ever created, and people throughout history have been telling other people, no, this is not for you. Suffragettes were told in the US and the UK, women can't ride. Black men and women were told, no, these clubs, these teams, these roads, these parks are not for you. 1942, the Germans confiscated bikes from Jewish men in the Netherlands and forbid them from riding. Saudi women were told bikes were illegal. Iranian friends and Afghan friends have been arrested for riding bikes. Transgender women and girls today are told, you can't race, you can't ride, you are not allowed to ride a bicycle. Palestinians who ride bikes are forced to ride separate roads under apartheid laws. They are not allowed to train on the same roads as Israeli citizens. Those that live in Gaza must train within the confines of a walled-off open-air prison, the length of which is less than the typical international road race. The Gaza Sunbirds are a paracycling team found by the members whose legs were lost during the Great March of Return, a series of peaceful protests where Palestinians walked to the border weekly for over a year to protest the injustice of being kept inside a concentration camp and the lack of mobility freedom, mobility justice. They were shot at, and soldiers purposely took kneecap shots. The founders of the team are those protesters who lost their limbs and who were cyclists. Most of those teams are survivors from that Great March of Return, which inspired solidarity rides today. Around the world, there's rides in Scotland, across the US, Canada, around the world, solidarity rides that are called the Great Ride of Return in support of Palestinians. One of those, showing the beautiful intersectionality of protest rides, is with Native Women Ride, an indigenous women's group. Bikes and bike justice are part of the ongoing genocide in Gaza, and the Gaza Sunbirds, still in Gaza, have focused their efforts on delivering aid. The founder is out in training to represent Palestine in the next South Asia Games, the same exposure that Afghan women sought to normalize their identity in bikes and to build support. We can't escape the messages and images flooding our phones. And as US citizens, our complicity when our weapons, money, and media coverage are involved means we must speak up. In Afghanistan, in Lebanon, or in Gaza. Protests are how we resist, how we build community and organize, and bikes have always played a part. We saw that energy in the wake of George Floyd's murder in the summer of 2020, with protest riots erupting weekly in New York City and across the US. Bikes are a vehicle for resistance and protest, and they have been ever since women began riding them in the 1800s. I ride with a group of women in Scotland in night rides to advocate for safe space for women. I ride with critical mass rides. I ride with climate justice rides. There's a group even in Edinburgh that organizes group bike buses to help get the kids safely to school. There are endless ways that bikes equal resistance, because bikes are about claiming space. The bike doesn't discriminate. People do. The Afghan women who led the two-wheeled revolution have shown the world their strength in various countries that they have now made their homes. Here in the US, in Canada, France, Germany, Italy. And Masuma, who I mentioned at the beginning, remember her name, she can't stop her bike without Fred Flintstoning. She represented as the first Afghan woman in the Olympics in Tokyo. It was overshadowed by the evacuation. She rode as part of the refugee team. She returned in Paris, not as a cyclist, but as the chef de mission of the international refugee team. She organized, ran the entire team. All the athletes from all the countries in all the sports. She stood next to Emmanuel Macron, the president of France, and in flawless French gave speeches. And in that same Olympics, in the Paris Olympics, for the very first time, 2 Afghan cyclists held up the Afghan flag and raced in road races. For the very first time, 2 women who were evacuated to Italy in a different evacuation than the one I mentioned, represented the tricolor, this was a big deal because it wasn't the Taliban flag, it is the tricolor that was a special agreement that was made with the Olympics to hold up the tricolor flag, get women representing Afghanistan in the Olympics in Paris. Hope and resistance and a decade of cycling changed community and culture in Afghanistan, but also this is a story that has played out all over the world, in our country as well. These Afghan women will forever be known for the contribution they have made to their country. But they've inspired all of us throughout the decade that they rode. Bell Hooks wrote, "Hopefulness empowers us to continue our work for justice, even as the forces of injustice may gain power for a time. To love by hope is to believe that it is worth taking the next step. Hope requires action to change the world. Change happens by pedaling the bike, not by standing beside it. Hope is what has allowed me to recenter storytelling and art and writing in a time where it feels impossible to speak, when it feels impossible to have a voice, as fascism is knocking at our door. Every time we rode in Afghanistan, young boys would trail us. They would gather, they would ask questions. I would always worry, are we going to get a rock thrown at us? Are the girls safe? But I can guarantee you that every single time there would be one boy, if not more, that would tell us, I'm going to go home and teach my sister how to ride a bike. That's hope. My version of bell hooks on hope is summed up by 3 words. And these 3 words are emblazoned on my single speed. It travels with me everywhere I go. It was on the very first blue Afghan jerseys The girls didn't know it was on their jerseys. That's okay. It's what allowed the Afghan cycling team to grow and train and flourish. It's what allowed me to evacuate them and keep the evacuation going. It's what builds community here and across borders. Change happens on and off the bike because each of us decides that we are willing to give a shit. And that we believe that we, in our own individual ways, are willing to do what we can to make the world a little bit better. Thank you for coming. I'm hot. I wore this because it's a dear Afghan friend who's a designer, but I think we're good. I think I represented. Okay. Questions? Please don't be shy. Any, all, everything. This is your chance. Yes, I think we have a microphone. Okay.
I mean, just beautiful. I mean, what you have done is amazing. My question, what brought you to Afghanistan? Why Afghanistan?
Oh, it's the hardest question. Literally, it's the hardest question. And I should just say, you can ask any question but that one. And it's the hardest question because I honestly don't know. I used to try to have a really pat answer and just be because I don't know. I know that I was awakened. I had a light bulb moment, and I woke up when I moved to Beirut briefly back in 2004, and I lived briefly in Beirut, too short of a visit. And that I lived in Europe for 10 years in my 20s. Beirut was the end of that, and it changed everything. I was more aware of everything. And Afghanistan, the US was complicit in Afghanistan. I wanted to understand Afghanistan and my country's role in it. I wanted to understand the corruption of international aid. Was there another way around that? And I wanted to know, I know that no woman is free until all women are free. And I didn't like the way Afghan women were portrayed as victims, and I wanted to understand it. So my very first trip, and then I'll go to the next question, was 4 weeks, not to save Afghan women, not to even do a project, just to listen, just to learn, just to try to understand. And then if I had a role, then I wanted to return. And I fell in love with Afghanistan immediately. I was intrigued, I was humbled, and I just kept returning and returning and returning and trying to be of service. Next question. Yes, in the back.
What makes you afraid?
I mean, I don't know if it's trite or not, but I mean, what makes me afraid was the question. To repeat that back for anybody who didn't hear it. Apathy, because I mean, I don't know if that makes me afraid or that makes me angry, probably both. Apathy. I don't understand how we can sit back and do nothing in the face of horrors, or just in the face of other people suffering, whether that's next door, whether that's outside, whether that's, across borders. But that makes me scared. There isn't very much else that makes me scared. That makes me scared. Yeah. Not doing right by my daughter, that'd be the other one. Next question. Yeah, please.
Hi.
Hi.
Sorry, I was
Please.
partially crying when you were speaking. So, I'm Afghan, and I have never seen someone talk about Afghanistan the way that you did. So, it was just, it was different to me, but thank you for doing that. And is there any effort to connect these Afghan cyclists who might be living in different countries now in a way so that they stay connected to each other, and in case if they're doing anything so that they can back up each
Absolutely.
other?
Can I ask where you're from, or where your family's from?
Oh, I'm from Afghanistan.
Yeah, which part?
Oh,
Or
so my parents are from Baghlan, but then I grew up in Balkh.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. And I did not get on a bike until I was 25 and I was in London. So I'm not that brave though.
Okay. I have been through Balkh. I've ridden in Balkh and Mazar Sharif and then across. It's beautiful. I can say that, one, thank you. That gives, and there's no higher praise than to know that I have done right by you. So thank you. So I'm in touch with everyone that I evacuated and those that were evacuated by others. Many are connected themselves. I mean, the beauty of this evacuation, I mean, there's no beauty with it. The beauty of the resettlement is it was all done digitally. It was the most bizarre experience. Everything was done on WhatsApp. Whether I was getting passports made in a third country and reverse smuggling them in, getting people across, finding safe houses, whatever it was all on WhatsApp. And so everybody is connected digitally, and lots of the women met for the first time in the safe houses because it was a mishmash of different groups coming together, and they bonded and stayed friends into their different countries. One big group went to Italy, and so they really bonded because they were in the safe houses and they went to Italy. And that group has kind of been the tightest. A lot of them had family connections as well. So there was they were cousins and other things. There was a lot of that, particularly from Bamiyan, the Hazara connection. There was a lot of the Hazars that were all loosely connected. I found out afterwards, they're like, well, you evacuated my grandmother. I'm like, when? Who? And they're like, oh, well, you find out that they're over there. So yes, and I am writing a book that is about because they don't all know each other, because the men tried to, the men in power, the Federation, tried to keep everybody siloed in order to have the power to control money, all of these things. So not every group knew each other. So writing essentially this decade of history that, what these women accomplished, that there's this decade of history that is told, kind of me being able to stitch it, but their narratives coming through it. And then there's a wealth, that's what I showed today of the photography. I have 10 years of photography. And what I was sharing with my dear family members that are here today, we have their firsthand, because they all had smartphones. So the latter part of the cycling years, they were taking selfies on the bikes and things, and some of that has survived. A lot of that had to get dumped when they crossed borders because the Taliban were searching phones, but some of it was survived. And so we have firsthand, so there's a photo archive. So my hope is that, these big, beautiful, art books become an Afghan cycling archive of this photo and narrative book that we could produce at some point. And that then brings a way of also bringing them all together to storytell, and then that reconnects them again. So, yes, lovely to meet you. Tashakor.
Hi, I have two questions.
Yes.
I'm assuming you learned Afghani because you've been there so much. And how did you do that? Was that self-taught, or did you go to school for that? And my second question is, again, you mentioned 28 trips. Were they funded by different people, or did you finance this yourself? How did all that come about?
So I learned Dari when I was in Afghanistan. When I first started traveling, it was almost impossible to find, there was no Google Translate with that. There's no Google Translate when I started traveling. But I was able to find a handful of words, all the polite words, and I was able to find a way of sounding them out. But I just had an amazing, driver and guide and fixer that I would work with when I was there. And over lunch, every day over lunch, we would work on, okay, I need 5 more words, and and I just slowly built it up. No, I didn't study it in school. I learned Dari in Afghanistan. Was never very good. The back and forth, but I learned enough at the time. And I don't speak any Pashto. There's two main languages, Dari and Pashto. I spoke some Dari. Funding. I mean, that is the barrier to everything, is funding. I would go to Afghanistan and I would come back and I would fundraise. Everything was self-funded or working on getting funding. I self-funded a lot. If I didn't have the money, I refused to not do it. So I would sell something, and I would get it done anyways. That's how the evacuations went as well. And I just found ways to get it done, and then and fundraise. The bane of getting any good work done. And that was, and I will say that is the question around fear. You saw the messages that were, that I got from a couple of the cyclists. I have hundreds, if not close to 1,000 of messages, just ongoing messages. And some of those I've been finally coming back to and looking at, and because I have all of them, and some of those are going into the recounting of the history of this. And the fact that I couldn't raise the money to get everyone out quickly, make the safe houses safer, better, feed everyone better. All these things, all it came down to was money. And to me, that's the thing that often frustrates me, makes me I'm fearing for their lives, they're fearing for their lives. It's the simplest barrier, and it's the hardest barrier. The complicated barrier was producing passports in a third country outside of Afghanistan, because the passport offices are closed, and then smuggling them into Afghanistan and dispersing them, and then smuggling people out of Afghanistan. All of the things, there's nothing simple about evacuating people from a country that has been, whose borders have been closed, whose embassies have been closed, whose passport offices have been closed, whose women are being told now you can't leave without an escort, all of the things, whose airports have been closed, whose land borders have been closed, and then evacuating them. But the only barrier I had was money. That is appalling. Sorry, that's a tangent, but next question.
So Shannon, I think we have time for one more question.
Okay.
And then we'll wrap it up.
Let's make it a good one, no pressure. Yeah.
How does one donate?
How is what?
How does one donate to the cause?
Oh, how does one donate? God, you know what? I didn't come prepared for that either. Actually, there is a GoFundMe so Bicycling Magazine did an incredible feature. I think the magazine's still up, because I saw it in the DC airport when I flew in, and that was so I think because I don't think they're doing it monthly. So Bicycling Magazine did an incredible feature, and it is online, called The Alchemists. Online it's called The Alchemists. I don't know what it is in the Bicycling Magazine article, or the print article, on Zara and Zakia, the Bambian founders, and our evacuation. So I then set up a GoFundMe to support the Hazara cyclists. So that would be where we could support, I could immediately come up with right now that we could support. There's a GoFundMe. It's linked on my Instagram. Should be linked to my Instagram. It's definitely linked on the article. So Bicycling, The Alchemists, Hazara cyclists. You want to support cyclists? I'm funneling the money back to them. Thank you for that question. You're amazing. Thank you for coming. Thank you for supporting. Thank you to the museum for this incredible installation and for bringing me out here.